Welcome back. We learned about Spark runtime architecture and I also talked about the Spark submit command. Now it's time to understand the Spark deploy modes. So let's start. The Spark submit allows you to submit the Spark application to the cluster, and you can submit the application to run in one of the two modes, cluster mode and client. But what is the difference? Let's look at the Spark runtime architecture. Here it is, correct? You are sitting on a client machine and you submitted the Spark application. This architecture shows cluster mode architecture. In the cluster mode, the Spark submit will reach the Yarn resource manager, requesting him to start the driver in an AM container. Yarn will start your driver in the AM container on a worker node in the cluster. Then the driver will again request Yarn to start some executor containers. So the Yarn will start executor containers and hand over them to the driver. Make sense? Great. So in the cluster mode, your driver is running in the AM container on a worker node in the cluster. Your executors are also running in the executor containers on some worker nodes in the cluster. Make sense? Great. I eliminated the option of the PySpark driver and the Python workers to keep it simple. However, if you submitted a PySpark application, you will also have a PySpark driver, and you may also have Python workers. PySpark driver will also run side by side in the same AM container, and the Python workers will run in the executor containers. We already learned that, right? Now, let's see what happens if you submit your application in client mode. Here it is. In this kind of setup, the Spark submit does not go to the Yarn resource manager for starting an AM container. Instead, the Spark submit command will start the driver JVM directly on the client machine. So in this case, the Spark driver is a JVM application running on your client machine. This is the same machine where you executed the Spark submit command. Now, the driver will reach out to Yarn resource manager requesting executor containers. The Yarn RM will start executor containers and hand over them to the driver. And that's all. The driver will start executors in those containers to do the job. Make sense? So the cluster mode and client mode have got only one difference. In cluster mode, your driver runs in the cluster. In client mode, your driver runs in your client machine. That is all. Everything else remains the same. All the executors will be running on the cluster in both cases. Make sense? Great. But how do we choose the deploy mode? I mean, when should you submit your application in client mode and when should you run it in the cluster mode? Well, you will almost always submit your application in cluster mode. It is unlikely that you submit your application in client mode. We have two clear advantages of running your application in the cluster mode. The cluster mode allows you to submit the application and log off from the client machine. Why? Because the driver and the executors are running on the cluster. They have nothing active on your client's machine. So, even if you log off from your client machine, the driver and the executor will continue running in the cluster. Your application runs faster in cluster mode because your driver is closer to the executors. The driver and executor communicate heavily, and if they are closer, you don't get impacted by network latency. Right? For these simple reasons, you will almost always run your application in cluster mode. But why do we have client mode? Well, the client mode is designed for interactive workloads. For example, Spark Shell runs your code in client mode. Similarly, Spark notebooks are also using the client mode. Why? We have two reasons. The first reason is the interactive mode. Spark Shell and notebooks give you an interactive method to work with Spark. You will submit some code using these tools. They will run the code and show you the results, right? So they use client mode and keep the driver running on the local machine. When a driver is local, they can easily communicate with the driver, get the results and show it back to you. The second reason is to make an exit easy. What does it mean? Simple. What happens if you log off from the client machine or stop the shell and quit? The driver dies, right? Because it was running locally. As soon as the driver dies, the Yarn resource manager knows that the driver is dead, and the executors assigned to the driver are now orphans. So the RM will terminate the executor containers to free up the resources. Make sense? That's why client mode was designed in Spark. However, you are most likely to use the cluster mode for submitting applications to run in the cluster. Make sense? Great. That's all about the deploy modes. See you again. Keep learning and keep growing.